Hello, and welcome back to Podfinder. This is day 2 of the 12 Days of Sinmas, and if you don't know what that means, pause this video and check out the playlist I've linked in the description. The Prelude video explains everything. Today, I'll be taking a slight detour on my examination of Thassilonian history to look at an aspect of Zin's discovery of Rune Magic which I only briefly discussed yesterday. I covered the theory behind Rune Magic in the last episode, but only briefly touched on the involvement of Lissala, the goddess who inspired much of Zin's work. Today, to lay even more groundwork for the ongoing story of the Runelords, I'm going to do the Podfinder thing and dig deep into the lore surrounding Lissala and her teachings. Before that though, if you enjoy this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing or commenting below. And, before I forget, check out the timeline I've put together of Thassilon's history. If you're a visual person, it will really help you get a hold of the history of Zin and the Runelords who would take over his empire. Link in the description. Alright, with that out of the way, let's dig into the rundown. Lissala is an ancient and mysterious goddess whose faith dates back to the earliest days of the Azlanti Empire. In the days of ancient Azlant and Thassilon, Lissala was known as the Order of Virtue, though in modern worship and study, she is instead generally referred to as the Scihedron Scion. Her areas of concern were magic, runes and writing, obedience, and fate, though her interest in obedience eventually grew into an interest in cruelty and punishment. During much of the Azlanti period, Lissala was considered a minor goddess, and was narrowly worshipped by scholars and wizards. The rise of Thassilon, however, facilitated a renaissance for her faith, and her connection to Zin's powerful rune magic cemented her legacy as a prominent and highly influential deity. At the height of her influence, Lissala was worshipped by a prominent priestly class, as well as a wide swath of the citizens of Thassilon, from archwizards and their apprentices to non-magical scholars and scribes. In modern times, the Church of Lissala has all but vanished from the face of Golarion, to the point that many scholars speculate that she is either dead or has abandoned the great beyond for parts unknown in the pursuit of greater knowledge. On that note, most of the information I discuss will be presented in the past tense, to indicate that her church is no longer active on Golarion, and hasn't been publicly active for thousands of years. Lissala typically presented herself in one of two ways. Her humanoid form, which she employed in times of peace, took the shape of a humanoid figure with Azlanti features, like tan skin and long dark hair. She dressed in flowing robes of gold and green, which were embroidered with snake-like patterns. Her holy symbol, a stylized Scihedron star, was also prominently displayed on her robes. Despite the relative normality of her form, her eyes were distinctly alien in appearance, and were sometimes depicted as glowing. Additionally, she had no visible mouth, and the lower half of her face was flat and featureless between her nose and chin. Occasionally, this form would also be depicted wearing a 7-tipped helm, though this was an inconsistent feature. When she expected conflict, however, or when she was angered, Lissala took on her serpentine form. This form was commonly depicted in Thassilonian art, especially art created by her more violent or aggressive followers. This form had the body of a snake, 6 feathered wings upon her back, and her holy symbol in the place where her head should have been. She commonly wielded a whip, her favored weapon, in this form. While this form was reminiscent of the Lilent Azadas of Elysium, no connection between these creatures and Lissala has been published. No information has been presented regarding Lissala's one-time home in the Great Beyond. My best guess, given her interest in scholarship and magical study, is that she made her home in Axis, the native home of Abadar, the Axiomites, and the Aeons. This plane matched her alignment during much of the Azlanti period, and her emphasis on the importance of laws, hierarchy, and study certainly fit thematically with the denizens of Axis. Alternatively, it's possible that Lissala maintained a home on a different plane, or maintained no home, and instead wandered the great beyond in search of knowledge. Unfortunately, we just don't know. Followers of Lissala were scholars of history, language, runes, and, most importantly, magic. Lissalans were eternal students, dedicated to earnest hard work toward achieving their academic and arcane goals. They thought in the long term, understanding that great achievements could only be attained with correspondingly great effort. They placed substantial importance on rules, laws, and hierarchy, and their careers were defined by master-pupil relationships. Lissalans could apply their skills in the direct service of the church as acolytes or priests, but could also serve faithfully in more secular positions of scholarship. They generally saw the importance of putting their expertise to use for the betterment of their community, but also generally saw no issue with institutions like slavery, so long as they existed within the bounds of the law. During the early Azlanti period, temples and churches to Lissala were rare. She was a minor goddess during this time, having been largely overshadowed by Amaznan, the Azlanti god of magic. Her followers were few and far between, though they weren't hunted or persecuted by any means. After the exile of Zin and his followers, Lissala's faith grew in prominence in Thassilon, becoming something close to a state religion. At this point, formal temples grew in prominence and opulence, very much in line with the fortunes of Thassilon itself. I'll be digging into the features of Lissalan Temples in extensive detail later in this video, as Paizo has provided plenty of detail on these structures, or at least the ruins of them. Shrines were common in Thassilon as well, and took the form of standing stones of green marble or gold-flecked gray stone. These stones were about the size of a human, and were carved or inscribed with the mark of a Scihedron rune. Followers would occasionally inscribe additional runes on these pillars, though always smaller and less prominent than the Scihedron. In addition to serving as religious symbols, these shrines were often the anchor points for powerful wards or enchantment spells throughout the Thassilonian period. Lissala's holy text was called Devotion to the Seven Forms. It consisted of an introductory chapter explaining the core tenets of her faith, then 7 additional chapters, each dedicated to one of the 7 schools of magic which Lissala deemed worthy of study: abjuration, conjuration, enchantment, evocation, illusion, necromancy, and transmutation. Notably, divination was considered a lesser form of magic, and Lissala taught that it was a means of bypassing challenges which would otherwise have allowed followers to learn and grow. The text also explained that runes were a gateway to power and understanding, but never made the connections between specific runes and schools of magic, or the idea that runes could be translated and understood as a kind of language. The impact of this text on Zin's development of rune magic cannot be understated. In especially valuable copies of the text, the opening page would often be crafted from flayed human skin, with the words having been branded or tattooed in place while the skin's donor was still alive. These donations were always willing, at least in the early days of the faith, and having one's skin used in the text after death was considered a tremendous honor. In the modern day, copies of The Devotion to the Seven Forms are vanishingly rare, and for reasons we will get into later, the few surviving copies are suspected to have been heavily edited or revised. Beyond her teachings regarding the 7 schools of magic, Lissala also taught the importance of the 7 virtues of rule, though it's unclear if she was the originator of these ideas, or if she was merely one of several proponents of them. She also emphasized the value of duty and hard work, and the righteousness of obedience to one's masters. In Lissala's view, worthwhile achievement was only ever the result of concerted effort, and deep understanding could only be achieved through rigid, structured obedience under the tutelage of a worthy master. Laziness was to be abhorred and avoided, while disobedience was to be punished severely. As mentioned earlier, Lissala's faith was most prominent in ancient Thassilon. Her influence in Azlant was always small, and late into the Empire's life, followers from Thassilon would specifically travel to Azlant to hunt and destroy local cults, whom they deemed heretics. Due to the size of Thassilon's empire, her faith had a relatively large geographic spread, from as far south as modern Magnamar and Korvosa, to as far north as the land of the Lenorm kings, to as far west as the hold of Belkzen. History and legends. Even more than most gods, Lissala is shrouded in an air of mystery. Her origins are entirely unknown, though it is clear that she existed at the start of the Azlanti period. She may have existed or seen worship during the Age of Serpents, or even before, but it's unconfirmed in the lore, and is only speculated about by scholars on Golarion. What is clear is that her disposition during the Azlanti period was far more neutral than it would be later on during the Thassilonian period. Lissala generally kept to herself during the rise of the Azlanti Empire. As a goddess of magic, she was mostly overshadowed by Amaznan. This status as a minor deity doesn't seem to have upset her, and she seemed content to allow her relatively few followers to serve quietly and advance themselves in Azlanti society. She didn't place much importance on evangelism, but is known to have proclaimed the values of the 7 Azlanti virtues of rulership. This all changed during the life of Xin. Xin's studies of rune magic relied heavily on the teachings of Lissala, and he drew connections between her 7 schools and the 7 virtues she professed. Notably, the raw power unlocked by practicing arcane magic through the framework of runes drew substantial attention to the runic aspect of her faith, which had been largely ignored up to that point. After Xin's exile, many of the practicing followers of Lissala traveled with him to Thassilon, where the faith became something of a state religion. This status wasn't necessarily official, and the worship of other gods was allowed, but the connection between Lissala and rune magic granted the church a huge amount of political power. This political power eventually translated into substantial economic and institutional power, as the Lissalan Church quickly became one of the chief producers of runic weapons and armor, vellum for the production of books, and educational materials related to magic, runes, language, and history. Of course, the evolution of rune magic into sin magic, which I'll be discussing further in the upcoming videos, had a substantial impact on the culture of Thassilon and its rulers. The abandonment of the 7 virtues of rule in favor of the 7 vices or sins led to a descent into decadence and cruelty throughout the empire. This had an impact on the Church of Lissala and even on the goddess herself. As the influence of sin magic grew, Lissala slowly took on more and more aspects of cruelty and vindictiveness. Lissala's firm view regarding the importance of obedience and discipline changed to an emphasis on the importance of punishment. She embraced a more tyrannical worldview, demanding that her followers obey her teachings and the orders of their superiors. Disobedience was met with harsh, vengeful retribution. Lissala also began accepting offerings of self-flagellation on the part of her worshippers. Such practices became common among followers of Lissala as the history of Thassilon progressed. This transformation of Lissala's worldview is noteworthy in that it is the most prominent instance I can think of in Golarion's history where the behaviors and opinions of a deity's faithful have directly altered the opinions and edicts of the deity themselves. But there was a strange mechanical and narrative tension regarding the faith of Lissala. Rune magic, at least under the Thassilonian interpretation, was an area of arcane study, while the most devout followers of Lissala were, by definition, clerics who practiced divine magic. Clerics were unable to access the power of rune or sin magic, leaving them at a substantial disadvantage when compared to their wizard counterparts. Worshippers seeking magical power were incentivized to take up arcane studies rather than the formal priesthood. Additionally, the corrupting influence of sin magic, and Thassilonian culture more broadly, led to more and more followers failing to earnestly obey Lissala's edicts. All of this culminated in a gradual but constant reduction in the number of Lissala's genuinely devout priests during the life of the Thassilonian Empire. This is best represented by Runelord Krune, the final Rune Lord of Sloth, who was the high priest of Lissala in the years leading up to the Earthfall calamity. Krune was a wizard, and had abandoned his position as a cleric even before becoming a Rune Lord. His path was one which many priests and priestesses had followed, to the point that, by the end of the Thassilonian Empire, only a few of the official Lissalan priests were devout clerics who received divine power from their nominal patron deity. During this time, individual temples often chose to focus on a single sin and its associated school of magic. Denizens of these temples would often revise their copies of the devotion to the 7 forms to inflate the importance of their chosen school. This was such a prevalent problem that a large portion of the surviving copies of the text in the Age of Lost Omens are considered to be unreliable to some degree. This is the period in which Lissala herself largely abandoned the Great Beyond. Her influence on the world diminished around and immediately after Earthfall, to the point that many scholars believed she was beginning to weaken or even die. Lissala was, during the Azlanti period at least, well regarded by her fellow deities. Though she kept to herself, she maintained positive, or at least neutral, relationships with her fellow members of the Azlanti pantheon, with the obvious exception of Achekik, who was insane at the time. Lissala even had a tolerable relationship with more chaotic deities like Desna prior to the rise of Thassilon. As mentioned already, Amaznan, the Azlanti god of magic, regarded Lissala as something of a rival, and by all accounts this feeling was mutual. Their rivalry doesn't seem to have been unfriendly in nature, however, as I haven't found any documentation of violence between their followers. While Lissala's emphasis on fate was only a minor aspect of her portfolio, it still created a small amount of tension between her and Pharasma. While the Lady of Graves taught the importance of divination and prophecy, Lissala took a different approach. She taught that the art of divination was a means of avoiding honest effort and oncoming challenges. Her teachings around faith emphasized the relevance of preparation for hard times and the acceptance that challenges would inevitably occur and must be overcome with hard work. After the rise of sin magic and Lissala's adoption of sadistic and cruel beliefs, her relationships with her fellow deities likely deteriorated. Little is documented about her relationships during this period, but presumably the good-aligned deities, like Desna or Akavna, began to distrust or even actively oppose her. And that's unfortunately all we know about her relationships during her active period on Golarion. Not to speculate too much, but if Lissala were to return to the Great Beyond in the Age of Lost Omens, she would almost certainly have a close relationship with Nethys, who didn't ascend to power until after her disappearance. Other deities of runes and magic, like Magrim and Magd, would likely take an interest in her as well, though their opinions on her might be more mixed. Lissalan Temples. Temples to Lissala were generally constructed of solid stone, either carved or magically conjured. They were typically large complexes, and as the Thassilonian Empire grew, the temples became increasingly self-contained and self-sustaining. They were usually structured around a heptagonal entry chamber, decorated in a Scihedron motif, with boarding rooms, kitchens, libraries, chapels, lecture halls, and storerooms branching off from the central chamber. Armies of priests populated these structures, and individual worshippers occupied their time performing magical research, inscribing spellbooks, scrolls, or magical runes for weapons and armor, or even copying non-magical texts. Life in these temple complexes was incredibly synchronized, as time management and scheduling were strongly emphasized by the faith for the purposes of living efficient lives. Temples were commonly decorated in green and gold, though the seven-color motif, referencing the 7 schools of rune magic, was commonly employed as well. In addition to the ever-present Scihedron and its associated fundamental runes, statues of Lissala were common, and were often cast in gold, bronze, marble, or other precious materials. The goddess was most commonly depicted in her snake-like battle form during the latter years of the Thassilonian Empire, and few statues of her more benevolent humanoid form have survived into the Age of Lost Omens. Other methods of decoration included lines upon lines of runes carved into walls, which in some cases were imbued with magic, so they might move and dance around. Though the high priest of the Lissalan Church in Thassilon was traditionally the Runelord of Sloth, or another high-ranking member of the nobility of Haruka, the largest temple in the empire was actually located in Bakrakhan, the realm of Wrath. This temple, creatively named the Great Temple of Lissala, was likely built by one of the Runelords of Wrath as a deliberate slight against the Runelords of Sloth, though that's just informed speculation on my part. The Great Temple of Lissala played host to an especially powerful artifact of the faith, the Chalice of Lissala. This cup was bestowed by the goddess upon her faithful to aid in their evangelism. It blessed its bearer with a powerful boost to their charisma, so they might more effectively preach their goddess's message, but also greatly enhanced their capacity for enchantment magic, so they might forcefully ensnare those to whom they spoke. In addition to spaces for worship, study, labor, and contemplation, several major shrines and temples to Lissala specifically developed rooms intended for the development and study of spells of each of the 7 primary schools of rune magic. These spaces were typically bathed in magical sin energy until they radiated the magic of their intended school, ensuring that spells of that school cast within them would be significantly empowered. Rooms dedicated to sloth were typically designed for comfort, and researchers often conjured powerful intoxicants so they might experience dreams or hallucinations which they believed were sent by Lissala herself. Spaces dedicated to envy were sometimes designed as meditation spaces, and were equipped with enchanted mirrors. These mirrors would project images to the viewer, showing them their friends, family, and even rivals, obtaining fame, fortune, and power beyond what the viewer could achieve. The goal of these images was to stoke envy in the heart of the viewer. Rooms dedicated to lust were, unsurprisingly, bathhouses, or similar functional spaces intended to bring inhabitants close together in various states of undress. The intent of these spaces was obvious. Spaces dedicated to greed were typically opulently decorated, even by the standards of the Thassilonian Empire. They were intended to cultivate expensive tastes in their inhabitants, with decor like rare pelts, lavish furniture, cloth of gold wall hangings, and other such extravagances. Rooms dedicated to wrath were typically places intended for combat, like arenas or dojos. They were often equipped with weapons of all types, but most commonly whips or similar weapons from the flail group. Inhabitants were expected to fight one another in violent displays. I couldn't find any examples of spaces dedicated to pride or gluttony. I suspect that the former would likely use a device similar to the Mirrors of Envy, but with the opposite effect, showing the viewer images of themselves accomplishing great deeds and filling them with a sense of entitlement. The latter, meanwhile, would likely take the form of dining halls or drinking rooms, where inhabitants could indulge in the finest delicacies the temples could offer. For players who might be interested in playing characters who follow Lissala, here are a few useful details. First and foremost, at time of writing, Lissala's faith is functionally dead on Galarian in the Age of Lost Omens. Until she returns as part of a Paizo publication, or your GM allows her to return as part of the lore at their specific table, she probably won't be a viable option for clerics or champions to follow. That said, much like Erodin, followers might exist who are members of non-deific classes. For those using the alignment rules, Lissala began the Azlanti period as a deity of lawful neutral alignment, accepting clerics of any lawful alignment, and possibly true neutral alignment, though that is unconfirmed in the 2e mechanics. As she embraced the vices of sin, Lissala shifted toward lawful evil alignment, accepting only that and lawful neutral alignment among her clerics. Her edicts are to work hard and demand others do so as well, and to cooperate or avoid conflict with Ophidian creatures. Notably, she has no listed edicts regarding the 7 virtues or their corresponding sins. Conversely, to disobey a superior, to shirk your duties, or to destroy a book are all anathema to Lissala. Her holy symbol is a variation on the Scihedron rune, one encircled by a band of gold. Quills were also often taken up as a sign of her faith. Her domains are fate, glyph, magic, and toil. Lissala's sacred colors are green and gold. These colors are common among her followers, and typically present in the form of flowing robes, cloaks, or capes. Embroidered snakeskin or scale patterns are a common motif, as are depictions of the Scihedron rune. Beneath their outermost cloak or cape, followers typically wear simple tunics or robes of brown or tan. Many followers expressed their devotion to their goddess's interest in runes by either branding or tattooing runic script onto their skin. It's possible that the spontaneously occurring runic birthmarks among the modern Varisians might have some connection to this practice. some followers went so far as to tattoo the script of Lissala's holy text onto their skin, so it might be harvested upon their death and used as the first page of one of her holy books. Lissala's sacred weapon is the whip. This weapon might have been commonly used among her clerics, but likely wasn't as widely used by her arcane followers due to the limitations of weapon proficiency. Followers who did use the whip made a habit of twisting it into the shape of a rune of their preferred school of magic as a display of faithfulness or as part of their daily preparations. Followers who practiced flagellation likely employed weapons which had the non-lethal trait, though the extent to which they used these in combat is unclear. Due to the emphasis on spell casting among her followers, simple weapons would have been common, and a reliance on martial skill likely would have been discouraged. Finally, followers seeking to emulate the Runelords or their sword-wielding champions, who I'll get into later in this series, might train in the specific polearm or sword used in their native kingdom. Lissala's favored animal is the serpent. Snakes were common among her followers as familiars, and other snake-like creatures, such as nagas, were treated with respect. Followers who made use of animal companions might have chosen from giant serpents as well. In modern times, animals with a connection to ancient Thassilon, like cipher gulls, might be thematic choices as well. In ancient times, much of Lissala's formal priesthood consisted of a mix of clerics and wizards. Clerics, likely of the cloistered doctrine, were the majority early on in Thassilonian history, while wizards grew in prominence throughout the empire's life. Lissala's emphasis on careful study attracted prepared casters far more than those who relied on natural talent and charisma, meaning bards and sorcerers were substantially less common, though the high number of powerful mages in Thassilon might have resulted in more than a few imperial bloodline sorcerers. Followers of a more martial mindset might be members of the magus class, weaving sword and spell together to great effect. They might have also been fighters, with an emphasis on formal instruction and training. In the Age of Lost Omens, clerics of Lissala are incredibly rare, to the point that they haven't been documented in scholarly society in a millennia. Oracles are substantially more common, and fill the role of priests in the small number of modern Lissalan cults. Humans of Azlanti descent were the dominant ancestry and ethnic group in Thassilon. Humans of Varisian and Shoanti descent were present as well, though they were largely considered second-class citizens, and were sometimes held as slaves. A few elves were present in the Empire as well, though I found no instances of elves involved in the Lissalan Church. Additionally, while not a player option, rune giants worshipped Lissala in ancient times, and to a small degree continue her worship in the Age of Lost Omens. Similarly, modern denizens of the territories where Thassilon once stood might find their way to her faith, though the relative dormancy of her faith might make that unlikely. These denizens might include humans of Varisian, Shoanti, Kelid, Ulfin, or even Chelish descent. Sovirian elves, or Abastani dwarves, inhabit these regions as well, as do the orcs of the Hold of Belkzen. The faith might even find its way to some of the hobgoblins of Oprok, or the occasional gnome or halfling in Varisia. Beastkin, with a connection to serpentine creatures, might also feel drawn to the faith of the Scihedron Scion, as might the Nagaji, though they are rarely found in Thassilon's former geographic envelope. Devout Lissalans are hard-working scholars who believe in the importance of discipline and dedication. They think in the long term and approach large-scale challenges and goals with a procedural and methodical mindset. They likely devote themselves to academic study, often in the fields of magic and runes. Those who follow her teachings from the Azlanti period might work toward the betterment of their communities, while those who follow the teachings of sin magic might embrace a more hedonistic or self-centered lifestyle. Followers in the Age of Lost Omens are likely the types of people who venerate the teachings of a deity with no expectation of divine blessings in return. Others might worship her in a mad, vain hope of her eventual return, so they might ascend to power. Either way, this could lead to some great roleplay potential. For GMs looking to integrate Lissala and her followers into a campaign, here are some ideas. Lissala's herald at the time of Earthfall was Kurshu the Undying, a being of chimeric construction, made from the parts of both birds and snakes. Kurshu survived the vanishing of her mistress from the great beyond, but found herself weakened and driven to despondency. I might get back to Kurshu in more detail if this series returns in the future to cover the events of the Age of Lost Omens. Lissala would show her favor to followers by presenting them with visions of her glowing alien eyes. She might also present them with visions of snakeskin patterns or runes. Especially favored followers might even find a spell slot not having been expended after the casting of a spell, or a scroll maintaining its power even after one use. Those she disfavors might find themselves unable to decipher complicated writing, or unable to focus on their work or the management of others. Rather than propose additional campaign or adventure ideas, which I will be doing throughout many of the remaining videos in this series, I want to propose a broad idea related to rune magic. The runes which underpin the field of rune magic are not associated exclusively with any one magical tradition. Arcane, divine, occult, and primal magics are all capable of producing runes as a byproduct of the spellcasting process. As mentioned in the video on Xin, artistic depictions of magic in Pathfinder products are inconsistent. Sometimes they show runes, sometimes they don't. It seems clear, though, that runes are intended to be a product of all forms of magic. So, why are the Runelords always wizards? True, Xin was a wizard, and his apprentices were, naturally, also wizards. But Lissala and her religious teachings were incredibly necessary to the development of rune magic, both before and after its initial discovery. So why, in 1200 years of Thassilon's history, did not a single cleric of Lissala become a Runelord? Well, Krune did, but not without retraining himself into a wizard. Why was there never a witch who had access to the arcane spell list that became a Runelord? Clerics and witches both have thematic ties to Lissala's emphasis on hard work and learned understanding, just like wizards, so it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch for one of these classes to take up the practices of rune magic. So this is my suggestion. Open up rune magic to other classes. In my mind, there is no good narrative reason, especially since the emergence of New Thassilon, for rune magic to be mechanically restricted to the wizard class. While the story of the mighty wizard kings of ancient Thassilon is fantastic as a piece of set dressing, and is a rich part of Pathfinder's history, the opportunity to tell new stories by allowing other classes to interact with runes and rune magic is simply too rich. While this is all wishful thinking and would constitute huge amounts of homebrew work on the part of a GM, I think it would be a natural evolution to the ongoing story of the Runelords. Runelord Sorshan herself has admitted that Xin's understanding of rune magic and the understanding of his apprentices was incomplete. Her discussion on the topic from Secrets of Magic suggests that her perspective is that of a master who is humbled by the extent of her chosen subject which she doesn't yet understand. Well, that concludes Day 2 of the 12 Days of Sinmas. I hope you've enjoyed this expanded look at the goddess of runes who inspired Xin's discovery of rune magic. While I recognize that this was a bit of a digression, I hope it was a useful one for providing context to the upcoming videos in this series. Tomorrow, I'll be picking up the story of Thassilon's history right where I left off, with the exploits of the Runelords immediately after the death of the first king Xin. While they would soon succumb to infighting, the Runelords definitely had a few more collaborative efforts up their sleeves, including the Emerald Chambers of Xin and the dreaded Rune Forge. See you tomorrow.